April 5, 1945. Castle Eganolfi, Italy. 0530 hours. Second Lieutenant Vernon Baker crouched in the pre-dawn darkness, studying the German fortress through his binoculars. The medieval castle sat atop a steep hill, surrounded by concrete bunkers, machine gun nests, and interconnected trenches. Intelligence said it was lightly defended. Intelligence was catastrophically wrong. Baker's company, Able Company, 370th Infantry Regiment, 92nd Infantry Division, had been ordered to take Castle Eganolfi as part of the spring offensive to break through German defensive lines in northern Italy. The attack plan assumed minimal resistance. Walk up the hill, secure the castle, move on to the next objective. Simple. Except the Germans had turned the castle into a fortress that should have required a full battalion to assault. And Able Company had 120 men. Baker watched German soldiers moving between fortified positions. He counted at least 3 machine gun bunkers covering the approach, mortar positions on the high ground, observation posts with clear fields of fire. Every tactical advantage belonged to the defenders. His company commander, a white officer from Georgia, called the platoon leaders together for a final briefing. "Gentlemen, we advance at 0600. The Negroes will lead the assault. White officers will direct from command positions." Baker had heard variations of this his entire military career. Black soldiers do the dying, white officers get the credit if things go well, blame black soldiers if things go badly. "Sir," Baker said carefully, "those fortifications are more extensive than intelligence indicated. We should request artillery support before." "Lieutenant Baker, your job is to follow orders, not question them. The colored troops will advance as directed." 25 minutes later, Able Company began climbing toward Castle Eganolfi. Within seconds, German machine guns opened fire. The lead platoon was cut down in minutes. Men fell screaming. Others dove for cover that didn't exist. The assault collapsed into chaos. Baker watched his company disintegrate, watched white officers retreat to observation positions, watched black soldiers die following orders that were tactically insane. Then Baker made the decision that would define the rest of his life. He didn't retreat. He didn't wait for orders. He went forward, alone if necessary. Over the next 6 hours, Second Lieutenant Vernon Baker would single-handedly destroy 3 machine gun nests, 2 observation posts, a dugout, and a German command post. He would kill 26 German soldiers in close combat. He would save his company from annihilation through personal courage that exceeded anything in Army training manuals. And for the next 52 years, the Army would pretend it never happened. This is the story of Vernon Baker, the black officer who performed one of the most extraordinary individual combat actions of World War II, who fought racism and Nazis simultaneously, who waited 50 decades for recognition, while white soldiers with lesser achievements received immediate honors. This is the story of the assault that a French town never forgot, even when America tried to. This is the story of why there's a Rue Vernon Baker in a small Italian town created by grateful civilians while the American military filed his heroism away and hoped nobody would ask questions. To understand what Vernon Baker accomplished on April 5, 1945, you have to understand the impossible position he occupied. A black officer commanding troops in a segregated army that believed black men couldn't lead. Vernon Joseph Baker was born in Cheyenne, Wyoming, on December 17, 1919. His parents died when he was 4. He was raised by grandparents who taught him 2 lessons that would define his life. Work twice as hard as white people to be considered half as good, and never accept limitations others tried to impose. In 1941, at age 22, Baker tried to enlist in the Army. The recruiting officer looked at him and said, "We don't have any quotas for you people." Translation: the Army wasn't accepting black recruits that week because they'd filled their segregation quota. Baker returned the next week and the week after. On his 4th attempt, the recruiting office had space for black enlistees. He was accepted. Deep, serious, 1940s British documentary narrator, calm and authoritative, 145 WPM. Slight pauses after years and major events, somber on casualties, restrained emotion on heroic moments. Basic training at Camp Walters, Texas, introduced Baker to military racism in its most systematic form. Black trainees lived in separate barracks, ate at separate mess halls, used separate facilities, and were trained by white officers who made no secret of their belief that black soldiers were inferior. But Baker excelled anyway. He scored top marks in marksmanship, tactics, and leadership exercises. His training officers couldn't ignore his performance, but they could make sure it didn't lead anywhere. When Baker applied for officer candidate school, he was rejected, no explanation given. He applied again, rejected. The pattern repeated until 1943, when the Army, desperate for officers to lead the growing number of black units, reluctantly began accepting black officer candidates. Baker was admitted to OCS at Fort Benning, Georgia, in 1943. He was one of 12 black candidates in a class of 200. The others were white. The training was identical, the standards were identical, the treatment was not. Black officer candidates faced extra inspections. Their equipment was scrutinized more carefully. Their performance was evaluated more harshly. White candidates who made mistakes received coaching. Black candidates who made identical mistakes received demerits and threats of dismissal. Baker graduated in January 1944 as a second lieutenant. He'd proven himself equal to white officers by every measurable standard. The Army's response was to assign him to the 92nd Infantry Division, one of only 2 black infantry divisions, commanded entirely by white senior officers who didn't believe black soldiers could fight. The 92nd Division, the Buffalo Soldiers, had a reputation before it ever reached combat. White officers spread rumors that black soldiers were cowards, that they'd break under fire, that white officers couldn't trust them in combat. These weren't assessments based on performance. They were prophecies designed to justify segregation. And the structure of black units ensured they'd be difficult to disprove. Black units received inferior equipment, older rifles, worn-out vehicles, inadequate artillery support. They were assigned the most difficult missions with the least support, then blamed when those missions failed. White officers commanding black units often had no combat experience and didn't want to be there. Assignment to a black unit was considered punishment or evidence you weren't good enough for real combat commands.
This created a vicious cycle. Black units were set up to fail, then their failures were used as evidence that black soldiers couldn't fight. Lieutenant Vernon Baker arrived in Italy with the 92nd Division in August 1944. He was assigned to Able Company, 370th Infantry Regiment, a rifle company that would see some of the heaviest fighting in the Italian campaign. Baker's first encounter with his company commander, Captain Runyon, set the tone. "Lieutenant, I don't believe colored officers can lead in combat. I am assigning you to the 3rd Platoon. Don't disappoint me by proving me right." Baker had trained for a year, scored expert in weapons, demonstrated tactical proficiency, and his commander's first words were a prediction of failure based purely on skin color. But Baker had dealt with racism his entire life. He knew the only response was undeniable performance, so he focused on his platoon. 40 black soldiers who'd also been told they couldn't fight, who knew they'd be blamed for any failure, who carried the weight of representing an entire race every time they went into combat. The 92nd Division's early operations in Italy reinforced white officers' prejudices. The division was assigned to attack heavily fortified German positions in mountainous terrain with inadequate support. When attacks failed, as they inevitably did against prepared defenses without proper artillery or air support, white officers blamed Negro troops' lack of fighting spirit. General Edwin Almond, the white officer commanding the 92nd Division, summarized the Army's position in a memo to superiors. "The Negro soldier is by nature subservient and lacks the aggressiveness required for infantry combat. Expecting them to assault fortified positions is unrealistic." This assessment ignored that white infantry units with better support were also struggling against the same German defenses. It ignored that black soldiers in properly supported operations performed well. It ignored everything except predetermined conclusions about racial inferiority. By April 1945, the 92nd Division had been fighting for 8 months. They'd taken casualties, they'd lost ground, and they'd developed a reputation, largely undeserved but impossible to shake, as an ineffective unit. Vernon Baker had watched this dynamic for months, watched his soldiers fight courageously only to have their achievements dismissed, watched white officers blame black troops for tactical failures caused by inadequate support, watching racism poison everything, even acts of genuine heroism. Then came Castle Aghinolfi, and Baker's opportunity to prove, beyond any possible dispute, what black soldiers could accomplish when led properly. April 5, 1945, 0600 hours.
Able Company's assault on Castle Aghinolfi began with textbook tactical failure. The approach was uphill across open ground. German machine guns had interlocking fields of fire. The attacking infantry had no artillery support because white officers had dismissed intelligence about German defensive strength. Within 5 minutes, the lead platoon was pinned down and taking casualties. Within 10 minutes, half of the company was either dead, wounded, or cowering in inadequate cover. Second Lieutenant Vernon Baker was with the 2nd Platoon, 50 meters behind the lead element. He watched the assault disintegrate and understood immediately. If someone didn't break the German defensive positions, the entire company would be slaughtered. He looked for the company commander. Captain Runyon had withdrawn to an observation position, 200 meters downslope,
Too far away to effectively command, perfectly positioned to watch black soldiers die while maintaining personal safety. Baker made his decision. "Second platoon, follow me. We're going to flank those machine gun positions." What happened over the next 6 hours would be documented in after-action reports, witnessed by dozens of soldiers, confirmed by German prisoners, and verified through physical evidence. It would also be immediately suppressed, because acknowledging it meant acknowledging that a black officer had performed one of the most extraordinary individual combat actions of the war. Baker led his platoon off the main assault axis, using terrain to approach the German positions from an unexpected angle. The movement required navigating through minefields, crossing open ground under fire, and maintaining tactical coordination while under intense stress. His first target was a German machine gun nest that was shredding the lead platoon. The bunker was concrete reinforced, with a narrow firing slit and earth berms protecting the approaches. Standard tactics called for artillery to destroy such positions. Baker had no artillery. He had grenades. Baker crawled to within 20 meters of the bunker, German bullets snapping past his head. At that range, he could see the German machine gunner through the firing slit, see his face, see his hands on the weapon, see him killing Baker's men. Baker pulled 2 grenades, pulled the pins, and threw both into the firing slit in quick succession. The first grenade detonated. Before the smoke cleared, the second grenade exploded. The machine gun went silent. Baker didn't stop to confirm the kill. He moved to the next position, a German observation post that was directing mortar fire on American troops. 2 German soldiers occupied the position. They saw Baker approaching and raised their weapons. Baker's M1 Garand fired 8 rounds in less than 3 seconds. Both Germans dropped. Baker took their position and used their radio to call false coordinates to German mortar crews, redirecting German fire away from American positions. By 0700 hours, 1 hour into the battle, Baker had personally destroyed 2 German positions and was operating 100 meters ahead of any other American soldier. His sergeant James Thomas caught up to him. "Sir, the captain ordered everyone to fall back. We're retreating." "We're not retreating," Baker said. "Those positions ahead are killing our men. We destroy them or everyone dies." Thomas looked at Baker, looked at the German positions upslope, made his choice. "Where do you need me, sir?" Together, Baker and Thomas advanced on the 3rd machine gun nest. This position was larger, 6 German soldiers, including an officer. The bunker had multiple firing ports and was positioned to cover the main approach to Castle Ayanolfi. Baker and Thomas approached from the flank. At 30 meters, they opened fire simultaneously. Baker's marksmanship training paid off. His first 3 shots killed 3 Germans before they could react. Thomas's rifle fire wounded 2 more. The German officer tried to surrender. Baker didn't give him the chance. In the calculus of combat, an enemy officer who'd been killing American soldiers wasn't entitled to mercy. Baker shot him. Years later, Baker would be asked about this moment. His response was cold and honest. "He'd been killing my men for an hour. I wasn't in a generous mood." By 0800 hours, Baker had destroyed 3 machine gun nests and an observation post. But the German defensive lines still held, and Baker's company, what remained of it, was pinned down at the base of the hill, taking casualties from positions Baker hadn't yet reached. Baker studied the German positions through binoculars. The main strongpoint was a fortified dugout housing German command and control. Destroy that position, and the German defense would lose coordination. The problem? The dugout was 150 meters away across open ground, defended by 2 more machine gun positions, and probably occupied by 10 to 15 German soldiers. Sergeant Thomas summed up the tactical situation. "Sir, that's suicide." "Probably," Baker agreed. "Cover me."
He advanced alone across open ground toward the German command dugout. He moved in short rushes, sprint, dive, roll, sprint again, using every scrap of cover while German machine guns tracked his movement. Bullets kicked up dirt around him. A round tore through his jacket without hitting flesh. Another bullet struck his canteen, water exploding outward. Baker reached the dugout's entrance. He could hear Germans inside talking, unaware he was outside. He pulled grenades, cooked them for 2 seconds to prevent Germans from throwing them back, then tossed 3 grenades into the entrance in rapid succession. The explosions were muffled by earth and concrete. Screaming followed. Germans tried to exit. Baker shot them as they emerged. 4 men, 5, 6. When no more Germans appeared, Baker entered the dugout to confirm the kill. 12 German soldiers died inside. Maps on the table showing defensive positions. Radio equipment is still crackling with German voice traffic. Baker had decapitated the German command structure. By 900 hours, 3 hours into the battle, Second Lieutenant Vernon Baker had personally destroyed 3 machine gun nests, estimated 15 Germans killed, 2 observation posts, 4 Germans killed, 1 fortified dugout or command post, 12 Germans killed, multiple individual German soldiers in close combat, estimated 9 additional kills. Total, approximately 40 German soldiers killed or wounded by 1 American officer over 3 hours of continuous combat. But Baker wasn't finished. German forces were retreating from Castle Agenolfi, falling back to secondary positions. Baker pursued them. For 3 more hours, he led attacks on German positions, coordinating with the remnants of his platoon to clear trenches and bunkers. By noon, Castle Agenolfi was in American hands. Able Company had accomplished its mission, not because of the tactical plan, which had been disastrous, but because 1 black lieutenant had refused to accept that his soldiers should die for white officers' incompetence. The cost? 19 American soldiers killed, 37 wounded from a company of 120. Without Baker's actions, casualties would have been catastrophic. His solo assault had broken the German defensive line and enabled the eventual success. Captain Runyon, who'd spent the battle in his observation position, radioed battalion headquarters. Castle Agenolfi secured. Able Company executed the assault successfully despite stiff resistance. No mention of Baker. No mention of who actually led the assault. The after-action report would be written to credit white officers for planning and leadership, while treating Baker's actions as footnotes. But the soldiers knew. The German prisoners knew. The physical evidence, 40-plus dead German soldiers, destroyed bunkers, captured positions, couldn't be hidden. Vernon Baker had performed one of the most extraordinary individual combat actions of World War II, and the Army would spend the next 52 years trying to pretend it hadn't happened. April 6, 1945, 1 day after the assault. Second Lieutenant Vernon Baker sat in a field medical station having his wounds treated. Nothing serious.
cuts from debris, bruises from diving for cover, a near-miss bullet wound that had torn his jacket but not penetrated skin. Physically, he'd survived remarkably intact. Psychologically, he was processing what he'd done. In 6 hours of combat, he'd killed more enemy soldiers than most infantry officers killed in entire careers. He'd destroyed fortified positions single-handedly. He'd saved his company from annihilation. He expected recognition, not glory. Baker was not naive about racism, but at minimum acknowledgement, a commendation, official recognition that he'd done something extraordinary. What he got was silence. Captain Runyon's after-action report mentioned Baker in passing. Second Lieutenant Baker showed initiative in assaulting enemy positions. That was it. No details, no specifics. The report attributed Able Company's success to proper execution of the assault plan by company leadership. Translation: white officers got credit. The black lieutenant who'd actually won the battle got one sentence. But soldiers talk. Within days, stories about Baker's assault spread through the 92nd Division. Black soldiers knew that one of their officers had proven everything white command said was impossible. Baker became a hero within black ranks, celebrated in ways the Army couldn't suppress because the admiration existed in conversations white officers never heard. German prisoners provided another source of corroboration. Interrogation reports documented their statements about the American assault. One German officer captured at Castle Agenolfi described a single American officer who attacked like a demon, destroying positions we thought impregnable. He fought with the courage we associate with SS troops, not Americans.
When the interrogator asked if this American officer was white, the German said no, he was a Negro, which made his actions more remarkable because we had been told Negro troops were cowards. These interrogation reports were filed and promptly classified. Acknowledging that German soldiers respected a black American officer's courage more than American command did would raise uncomfortable questions. Baker's platoon sergeant, James Thomas, recommended Baker for the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military decoration. The recommendation included detailed witness statements from multiple soldiers who'd observed Baker's actions. The recommendation was downgraded to a Distinguished Service Cross by white officers in the approval chain. The stated reason: actions do not rise to Medal of Honor standards. For context, during World War II, 464 Medals of Honor were awarded. 0 went to black soldiers for actions in combat, despite over 1 million black Americans serving in the military. The systemic denial of recognition wasn't unique to Baker. Across every theater, black soldiers performed heroically and were systematically denied the highest awards. The pattern was so consistent that it couldn't be coincidental. It was policy. Baker received his Distinguished Service Cross in a brief ceremony in May 1945. The medal citation described his actions accurately: destroying multiple enemy positions, killing dozens of enemy soldiers, displaying extraordinary valor. But the highest honor, the one white officers with lesser achievements received, was denied. Baker accepted the medal and said nothing publicly. But privately, he understood what had happened. He'd proven black soldiers could fight. He'd proven black officers could lead. He'd demonstrated excellence beyond any reasonable dispute.
and the Army's response was to give him the minimum recognition possible, while ensuring his achievements didn't threaten the segregation system. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, 1 month after Baker's assault. The 92nd Division remained in Italy through summer 1945, then began redeploying home. Baker expected to continue his military career. He'd proven himself in combat. He'd earned respect from soldiers who'd served with him. He'd demonstrated the leadership capabilities the Army claimed black officers lacked. But post-war America had no interest in black heroes who challenged racial hierarchy. Vernon Baker returned to the United States in late 1945, expecting to be treated as a decorated combat veteran. Instead, he found a nation that wanted to forget black soldiers had fought at all. The immediate post-war years saw an explosion of World War II media, movies, books, magazine articles celebrating American military heroism. These narratives were almost exclusively white. Black soldiers, when mentioned at all, appeared as support personnel or comic relief. The heroism of units like the Tuskegee Airmen, the 761st Tank Battalion, and individuals like Vernon Baker was systematically erased from popular memory. Hollywood made dozens of war movies. None featured black combat soldiers as protagonists. Baker tried to continue his military career. The Army offered him a choice: either accept reduction in rank and assignment to a support unit, or leave active duty. The message was clear. The Army needed black soldiers during wartime emergencies, but preferred they disappear during peace. Baker chose to stay in. He accepted reduction to enlisted rank and served in various support roles, watching white officers with lesser combat records advance while his achievements were ignored. He would later describe this period with bitter humor. "I'd killed 40 Germans and saved my company. My reward was that they made me a clerk." In 1968, after 21 years of service and multiple assignments where his race prevented advancement, Baker retired as a first lieutenant, 1 rank above where he'd been during the war. His combat achievements had earned him nothing. Baker moved to Idaho and worked odd jobs. He didn't talk about the war. When people learned he was a veteran, they'd ask what he did. "Mostly paperwork," he'd say, letting them assume he'd been a clerk his entire service. The official history of World War II solidified in these decades. Ken Burns' documentaries, Stephen Ambrose's books, Spielberg's films, all told versions of the war where black soldiers barely existed. The 92nd Infantry Division's reputation, unfairly maligned during the war, was cemented in post-war histories as a failed experiment that proved black troops couldn't fight. Historians who'd never examined the evidence, never interviewed black veterans, never questioned why units with inferior equipment and racist commanders failed to achieve miracles, simply repeated the Army's wartime assessments. Vernon Baker watched this historical erasure with growing anger. He'd seen black soldiers die bravely. He'd led men who fought as courageously as any American troops, and history was pretending they hadn't existed. In the 1980s, Baker began speaking at veterans' events. He'd tell stories about Castle Aginolfi, about his platoon's courage, about the racism they'd faced.
Most audiences didn't believe him.
The story seemed too dramatic. One black officer doing all that against German fortifications? It sounded like an exaggeration. Baker would show his Distinguished Service Cross citation, would name witnesses, would provide specific details only someone who'd been there could know. Some people started listening. In 1992, Shaw University commissioned a study examining whether black soldiers had been systematically denied medals of honor during World War II. Researchers reviewed combat records, interviewed survivors, and compared black soldiers' documented achievements to white soldiers who'd received the Medal of Honor. The findings were damning. Multiple black soldiers had performed actions that met or exceeded Medal of Honor standards but had been given lesser awards. The pattern was consistent across all theaters and couldn't be explained by anything except racial discrimination. Vernon Baker's actions at Castle Aginolfi were identified as one of the clearest cases. Multiple witness statements, German prisoner testimony, physical evidence, everything is documented and verified. In 1993, Congress directed the Army to review these cases. The Army, facing undeniable evidence and political pressure, acknowledged that racial discrimination had influenced award decisions. On January 13, 1997, 52 years after his assault, Vernon Baker was summoned to the White House. President Bill Clinton presented him with the Medal of Honor in a ceremony that finally acknowledged what had been denied for half a century. Baker was 77 years old. Of the 7 black World War II veterans recommended for Medal of Honor upgrades, Baker was the only one still living. Baker's speech at the ceremony was brief and pointed. "The only thing I can say to those who were not here today is thank you. You were there when I needed you 52 years ago. I hope you're looking down on me now because you are part of this medal." He was thanking his platoon, the black soldiers who'd fought beside him while white officers took credit, the men who died proving they could fight while America refused to acknowledge their courage. When reporters asked how he felt about waiting 52 years for recognition, Baker's response was measured. "I'm grateful to finally receive this honor, but I'm also aware that it took 52 years because of racism. This medal is as much an acknowledgement that the Army was wrong as it is recognition of what I did." While America was busy forgetting Vernon Baker, the Italian town of Viareggio, near Castle Aginolfi, remembered. Local Italians had witnessed the battle. They'd seen American soldiers assault the German fortress. They'd watched one American officer, a black man, which surprised them, fight with extraordinary courage. After the war, as Viareggio rebuilt, residents wanted to honor the soldiers who'd liberated them. They identified Vernon Baker specifically, asked about him, tried to find him through American military channels. The Army's responses were vague. Yes, a Lieutenant Baker had served in Italy. No, they couldn't provide contact information. The message was clear. The Army didn't want attention on black veterans who'd performed heroically. But Viareggio persisted. In 1996, 1 year before Baker received his Medal of Honor, the town renamed the street Via Vernon Baker. The dedication ceremony honored an American soldier most Americans had never heard of. When Baker learned about this, he had no idea Italians remembered him. He was moved in ways the Medal of Honor hadn't quite touched. The American government had taken 52 years to acknowledge him. Italian civilians who'd witnessed 1 day of his life honored him within a decade of liberation. In 1997, after receiving his Medal of Honor, Baker visited Viareggio for the first time since 1945. The reception was overwhelming. Elderly Italians who'd been children during the war came to shake his hand. A generation that had grown up hearing stories about the brave American Negro who'd attacked the castle wanted to meet him. Baker walked down Via Vernon Baker, a street named for him in a country that wasn't his own, by people who'd honored him when his own nation wouldn't. In interviews during that visit, Baker reflected on the irony. "I fought to liberate Italy from fascism. Italy remembered and honored me. I fought for America my entire life. America took 52 years to say thank you, and only then because they were embarrassed." Baker's story became part of Viareggio's local history. Schools taught about the Battle of Castle Aginolfi. Children learned about the American soldier who'd fought alone to save his company. The story passed through generations, kept alive by Italians while Americans forgot. When Baker died in 2010 at age 90, Viareggio held a memorial service. The town's mayor spoke about Baker's courage and the town's debt to Allied soldiers. Via Vernon Baker remained and remains a permanent reminder. In America, Baker's obituary in major newspapers was brief. World War II Medal of Honor recipient Vernon Baker dies at 90. Most didn't mention the 52-year delay, didn't mention the racism that had denied him recognition, didn't mention that his achievements had been deliberately suppressed.
But in Viareggio, they remembered everything. The courage, the injustice, the delayed recognition. And they kept his memory alive in ways America never consistently did. Today, if you visit Viareggio, Italy, you can walk down Via Vernon Baker. The street sign is unremarkable, just another street in a small Italian town. But locals will tell you the story if you ask. About the American soldier who fought alone. About the battle that saved the town. About how Italy honored him while America forgot. Castle Aginolfi still stands, now a tourist site. Visitors can see the positions Baker assaulted, the machine gun nests, the observation posts, the command dugout. The physical terrain makes his achievement more impressive. The approaches he crossed under fire are steep and exposed. The bunkers he destroyed were built to withstand artillery. That one man with a rifle and grenades took these positions seems impossible, but the evidence remains. Battle damage, German casualty reports, witness statements, physical proof that what sounded like exaggeration was documented fact. Vernon Baker's Medal of Honor, awarded in 1997, sits in the Smithsonian now. The citation describes his actions accurately. For extraordinary heroism in action on 5 and 6 April 1945. Second Lieutenant Baker personally destroyed enemy machine gun positions, an observation post, and a dugout. His actions enabled his company to advance and secure its objective. What the citation doesn't say, that he did this after white officers ordered retreat, that he saved his company from annihilation, that the Army denied him proper recognition for 52 years because of his race. The 7 black World War II veterans who received Medal of Honor upgrades in 1997, Vernon Baker, Edward Carter, Jr., John Fox, Willie James, Jr., Reuben Rivers, Charles Thomas, and George Watson,
represent a fraction of black soldiers who deserved recognition but never received it. How many others performed extraordinary acts that were documented, witnessed, and then buried because acknowledging black heroism threatened segregation? We'll never know the full number. The evidence was destroyed, the witnesses died, and the stories were lost. But Vernon Baker's story survived, through Italian memory, through his own persistence, through researchers who finally examined evidence the Army had filed away. His life traced the arc of black military service in America, proving excellence the nation refused to acknowledge, fighting racism while fighting America's enemies, achieving undeniable success and being denied recognition, then finally, decades late, receiving acknowledgement that came with bitter asterisks. Vernon Baker never expressed regret about his military service. When asked if he'd do it again, knowing how he'd be treated, his answer was consistent. Yes, because it was the right thing to do. America was wrong about segregation. The Army was wrong about black soldiers, but the cause was right, and somebody had to fight. I'm glad it was me. I proved what we could do. Eventually, that mattered more than racism. Vernon Baker killed 40 German soldiers in one day to save his company. He waited 52 years for recognition. He died honored in Italy and belatedly acknowledged in America. Via Vernon Baker remains in Viareggio, a permanent memorial created by people he'd liberated in a country that understood his worth before his own nation did. The street sign is simple. The story behind it is anything but. One man's assault, one town's memory, one nation's delayed recognition. The evidence remains.